name is Rick. This is the Dwarven Fortress of Swamp Cavern. This video is about keeping your fortress running quickly and smoothly. I recently tried to run this fort forward many years, so that the giant tigers could grow up. The fort was struggling, so I started doing everything I could think of to speed it up. When I posted about this on Reddit, I got a lot of great responses. So what I'm about to say is not just my experience with FPS, but sort of the combined knowledge of the Dwarf Fortress subreddit as well. First, I'm going to talk about what makes the game of Dwarf Fortress slow down. Then I'm going to show all the things I did in my fort to make it run faster. Last, I'm going to talk about tips I got from the Dwarf Fortress subreddit, so stick around to see if I mention some of your feedback somewhere in there. Basically put, here's my tip for keeping your fort running fast. No matter how many years old the fort is, figure out what your computer can handle and stay under that limit. For me, that's 350 dwarves on a small Embark with no waterfall if they are almost all training in the military at the same time. Or I can have 200 dwarves and animals and pets on a much larger Embark and get the same speed. In this example, I have 256 people and pets in the fort, and am paying for it with a loss of speed. There are trade-offs in the game. For instance, an Embark that's 1 or 2 or 3 squares are not that different from each other. When I play, I'd rather play on a larger Embark and turn the maximum number of dwarves down. FPS stands for frames per second. A high FPS means things happen quickly. Low FPS means the game and your dwarves move at a slow speed. The speed Dwarf Fortress runs at is determined by how many dwarves you have, what's going on in the world, how big the world is, and how powerful your processor is. FPS death in a fort is when the fort is running so slowly that you don't want to play it anymore. I like to leave FPS showing, because if it ever suddenly drops, you know something is going on. Here are the things that slow down a game of Dwarf Fortress, roughly in order of how strongly they do it. The number of dwarves in your fort, also other people and animals. Animals in cages hurt FPS much less, but they still do a little, especially if you have a lot of them. Also, the amount of wildlife on the map, and it depends on what they are doing. Dwarves training in the military or goofing off in the tavern lower FPS very little. Dwarves rushing off to build a wall or move goods from the trade depot are going to hurt it more. Bad guys hurt FPS just as much as dwarves, or more depending on what they are doing. 20 trundles stepping onto the map at once is going to make the FPS drop a little. If they climb to the roof and get stuck, trying to path and not doing it, they will hurt the FPS by a great deal. The size of the Embark. 1, 2, or 3 square Embarks hurt FPS very little. A 3x3 or 3x4 is about the same hit as 10 or 15 dwarves on my machine. Your mileage may vary. Having a huge Embark, more than 3x4, is going to cause a noticeable drop in FPS. Water features or machinery. This depends on how big and how complex. Having a waterfall that splits 6 different ways and runs all over your fort is going to cause a certain amount of FPS loss. Then again, a waterfall that falls through 5 levels of hallways and then a tavern causes surprisingly little if it connects directly to a river and dumps the water off screen directly. Items in the world. A dedicated builder might have tens of thousands of stones sitting around their fort. This is not going to make much difference, but people building on a bigger scale might have hundreds of thousands of stones sitting around on the map. Eventually that is going to add up. I would recommend just deleting some of it off the map if this is happening to you. Items in stockpiles. Even less so than items sitting in the world, but still has an effect. The size of the world you are playing on, and the length of its history. This makes perfect sense. The bigger the world, the more going on off-screen. The longer the history, the more beings there are to keep track of, usually. On small or smaller worlds, there's not much FPS loss on my machine. Bumping that up to medium creates a measurable loss, in that things can be going quite steadily in the fort, and the FPS may go up and down anyway. I believe that's the world simulating goblin invasions or wars between nations. I'm sure playing on larger worlds would create more FPS drop, not a ton, but some dwarves worth. Pathing, roughly defined as the number of places your dwarves could possibly go. I mentioned this one last, not because it isn't powerful, but because it's more work than the other ones. You have to be really consistent with this one to get anything out of it. That didn't stop me from trying to use this one myself. I'll explain when we get to the part about tips for making your fort run faster, which is right now. The most powerful tip I have for keeping your fort running fast is don't have too many people and animals in your fort. If you have hundreds of animals in cages, they need to go if they're slowing down your fort. Wildlife usually doesn't hurt your FPS much, until it does. In Swamp Cavern more than once, Crundles climbed to the top of the roof and got stuck there, really making the FPS drop. We dug out tunnels and fortified the walls so that we could shoot them, and every time we got one, the FPS would get better, thus proving that they were the source of the problem. Limit the size of your Embark to what your computer can handle. I like playing on larger Embarks because it's easier to get more than one kind of biome, and your chances of getting more than one source of pretty bluestones go way up. What is on those Embarks matters. Trees in the long run are a drain on FPS because they try to grow constantly, so much so that I build roads to limit their numbers. Mushroom trees count. One thing working in your favor is many caves don't have a source of water, and then the whole level won't have trees growing on it. This happens so commonly that I kind of gamble on it. My computer can't really handle 200 dwarves and a 3x4 Embark at full speed, unless one or more levels doesn't have trees on it. Then it can. I like to run the dfhack command to clean all. I find it's usually good for a couple of frames per second, and usually does not affect the gameplay in any way, unless you are trying to run a vampire fort. There's no way for contaminants to get cleaned off the map currently, so for the vast majority of players, it slows the game down and does nothing at all. Yes, I know, this is how deadly dust gets tracked into your fort from a forgotten beast. But until the dwarves learn how to do some biohazard tech, or the game gets fixed, so it doesn't constantly slow down in order to keep track of multiple layers of vomit, I like using clean all. Feel free to have long-winded discussions about this in the comment section. You know you want to. Even if I didn't run this command sometimes, so that there were not huge trails of vomit all over my forts on my Armok vision shots, I would still use this command to keep my forts running their fastest. Having a few thousand things in your stockpiles is not going to hurt your FPS any. Having more than that is going to start. Having way more than that is going to hurt your FPS some. If you're going over 100,000 blocks of stone, consider selecting some and using dfhack to auto-dump delete. In the case of Swamp Cavern, we stopped all farming and food buying and just switched to living off the vast stockpiles to bring them down a little bit. At first I used this drawbridge as an atom smasher to get rid of garbage from this dump and corpse stockpile over here, but it was constantly overflowing. Currently, after an invasion, I hand select a lot of the gory bits myself, and then use dfhack's auto-dump delete command, because what's the difference between that and using a drawbridge? A bunch of cranky, traumatized dwarves and nothing else, that's what. I then make the dwarves clean up the rest because I'm too lazy to do it for them. Water causes an FPS hit to varying degrees. I floored over all the ponds around Swamp Cavern so that they wouldn't endlessly have a tiny bit of extra water on top of them every time it rains, which it constantly does. The fort's waterfall really doesn't hurt the FPS very much, partly because the path to it and from it is both short and direct. I was trying so hard to reclaim FPS that I turned off the waterfall and made this outlet more narrow. My concern was that too much water was evaporating on the way off the map, causing unnecessary calculations. When I made the hallway more narrow, it did make the water back up a little more, but not dangerously so, and now it makes it off the map more reliably, I feel. This waterfall slows down the fort so little compared to other things that at a time when I was trying to get every last little bit of FPS out of the system, I turned the waterfall back on, because I felt like the 1.5 or so FPS it was costing was worth it. Turn off big pump stack projects when you're not using them. Even a medium-sized one causes a fair-sized FPS hit. Large ones must only be worse. Late in Swamp Cavern's history, I tried to seal off unused levels and rooms. I mentioned this last not because it isn't powerful, but because it takes a little more work than every other tip so far. This tip would be easiest to do if you were consistent with it. Every time you opened a new mineral, vein, or mining level, if you sealed it up when you were done with it, it would help your FPS. Locked doors would be good, walls even better. A really easy way to do this, for instance, would be to place 4 doors on the mining level and then just lock them when you were done. I do like this tip enough that I tried to do it myself, but doing it after the fact in Swamp Cavern was proving to be impossible. I put in walls all over the place blocking off levels from unused areas. But because I didn't do this from the start, what little I did of it was not having much of an effect, not compared to all the other stuff I did. There's also the concept of throughput in Dwarf Fortress. Here I made a hallway 5 tiles wide because the trade depot was at one end, and at times 100 dwarves might be bringing things to or from it. Having so many possible paths doesn't speed up the FPS, but having a lot of dwarves be able to get in and out at once speeds up how quickly they can be done with the task. I recently posted my tips to the Dwarf Fortress subreddit, and I got some really valuable feedback. Here is a list of suggestions from other players in no particular order. Sell everything you have that is non-essential. Encrust everything in the fort with gems, bones, shell, ivory, pearls, whatever. It will bring the total value up and the number of items down. Put children in a burrow with food, drink, and playthings. Increase the amount of fun you are having, faster than you are gaining dwarves. Keep stockpiles small. If they are going over 5x5, switch to quantum stockpile. Keep everything in a 1x1 square, so 48 square center of the map. Use the rest of the map for minerals, but keep the fort to that area. Work orders keep food, drink, plant stockpiles to a minimum. 1,000 drinks and 1,000 prepared meals. Anything else to refuse stockpile. Make soap, clothing, and whatever else as needed, so as not to have stuff sitting around for no reason. Refuse/clothing stockpile to automatically pick up tattered or discarded junk and delete it. Have a fresh clothing inventory to replace it. Stay under 100 dwarfs. Tons of atom smashers, and later on magma chambers to dispose of wreckage from a siege. Saves on FPS and prevents huge negative stress from dead bodies. I have several reactions to this advice, and that is yup, and yup. In Swamp Cavern I went around by hand, finding ragged or crappy clothes, and deleting them myself. I also had a dump where they were supposed to put it, and I deleted things from there regularly also. I really like the small area idea. If you really want good FPS, that's a good way to do it. Captain Duck would build these forts in a square area around a staircase, and then dig out a huge moat around it many levels deep. The fort would end up being in the small but highly vertical space. This would be extremely FPS efficient because there was only so many places the dwarves could even think about going. I don't think Swamp Cavern quite lives up to that 48 block idea, but it comes close, because it was built with that kind of idea in mind. Everything was meant to be close to everything. One last suggestion I got was to keep the dwarves under 50, because that way you get to know them better. This would keep the FPS in top running shape, I'm sure, Depending on what you're trying to do, how many dwarves do you really need? But when it comes to getting to know your dwarves, I recommend naming them. All of them. I know it sounds like a lot of work, but I feel it really adds a lot to the game. You get to know your nobles better, your militia captains, your legendary heroes, whether they are legendary axe users or a legendary clothier. To make it less work for myself, I name them after combinations of things that they like, or sometimes distinct personality traits. If you found this episode helpful, share it with Dwarf Fortress fans. Subscribe and hit the bell icon so you can be notified when new episodes come out. Hitting the like button helps too. If you'd like to see the fort battling goblins using tamed giant cave spiders, I got that. If you'd enjoy a detailed tour of this fort, that's going to be up on screen somewhere. Those things that look like ghasts in a snowstorm in a jungle during sunset is the subscribe button. That's a fun button to hit. YouTube hasn't an opinion on which of my videos that you might like, so that's up there too. Thanks for watching.